It's the dead of night in occupied France, 1944. A woman cycles frantically through the darkness, her legs burning with exhaustion. She's been pedalling for over 300 kilometres across mountain passes and through German checkpoints. One wrong move, one suspicious glance from a Nazi patrol and she's done for. But she can't stop. Lives depend on the message she carries in her head. No written notes, no evidence. Just memory and determination. This wasn't some Hollywood fantasy. This was Nancy Wake, and she was about to change the course of World War II. When we think about the heroes of the Second World War, we usually picture soldiers storming beaches or pilots dogfighting in the skies. But there was another war happening in the shadows of occupied Europe, a war of deception, courage, and impossible odds. And some of its most effective warriors were women who the enemy dismissed as harmless, right up until the moment those women destroyed their supply lines, rescued their prisoners, and turned entire regions into resistance strongholds. The Gestapo called Nancy Wake the White Mouse, because no matter how hard they tried, they could never catch her. They put a 5 million franc bounty on her head, making her one of the most wanted people in all of France. But Nancy Wake wasn't just running from the Nazis, she was hunting them. To understand how one woman became the Gestapo's worst nightmare, we need to go back to before the war, to a young journalist living the high life in 1930s Paris. Nancy Wake had grown up poor in Australia, but she'd clawed her way to Europe through sheer determination and a small inheritance from an aunt. She worked as a reporter, married a wealthy French industrialist named Henri Fiocca, and lived in a luxurious apartment in Marseille. Life was good. Then came 1938 and a reporting assignment in Vienna that changed everything. Nancy witnessed Nazi soldiers forcing Jewish people onto a large wheel in a beautiful town square, whipping them as they spun around while crowds watched. The cruelty was casual, almost routine. Something broke inside her that day. She later said she resolved then and there that if she ever had the chance, she would do anything, however dangerous, to make things difficult for the Nazi party. When Germany invaded France in 1940, Nancy got her chance. She and her husband Henri began using their wealth and connections to help the French resistance. Their luxury apartment became a safe house for people fleeing the Nazis. But Nancy wanted to do more than just provide shelter. She became a courier for the Pat O'Leary escape line, one of the most important resistance networks in France. The escape lines were nothing short of miraculous. Imagine you're an Allied bomber pilot. Your aircraft takes a hit over occupied France, you bail out, and suddenly you're behind enemy lines in Nazi territory. If you're captured, you're going to a POW camp at best. But if you're lucky, if you're incredibly lucky, the resistance finds you first. That's where the escape lines came in. The Pat O'Leary line, the Comet line, and others formed intricate networks of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. They would hide downed airmen in attics and cellars, provide them with false identity papers, civilian clothes and forged documents. Then, link by link, safe house by safe house, they would move these airmen across hundreds of miles of occupied territory. Nancy Wake's role was crucial. She would escort Allied pilots through the streets of Marseille, past German checkpoints, chatting and laughing as if they were old friends out for a stroll. Her charm and confidence were her camouflage. German soldiers saw a fashionable woman in elegant clothes and never suspected that the man on her arm was an enemy airman she was smuggling to freedom. The escape lines collectively saved over 7,000 Allied military personnel, mostly airmen. Think about what that meant. Each of those pilots represented months or years of expensive training. Getting them back meant they could fly again, bomb again, fight again. But more than that, it meant incredible morale boosts for bomber crews who knew that if they went down, there was a chance, a real chance, that brave people would risk everything to bring them home. Nancy personally helped rescue over 100 Allied pilots during her time with the Pat O'Leary line. She and her fellow resistance members would guide them through a network of safe houses to isolated beaches near Marseille, or help them make the treacherous journey over the Pyrenees Mountains into neutral Spain. From Spain, they could reach Gibraltar and eventually get back to Britain. But the danger was constant and real. The people running these escape lines weren't soldiers with training and weapons. They were ordinary civilians, shopkeepers, doctors, housewives, putting themselves and their families at extraordinary risk. If an Allied pilot was caught, he'd face a POW camp. If the resistance helpers were caught, they faced torture and execution. Over 500 people involved in escape lines were captured and perished in concentration camps or were executed outright. By 1943, the Gestapo was closing in on Nancy. They'd been hunting the White Mouse for months, following leads, torturing suspects, slowly unravelling the resistance networks. Nancy knew her time in France was running out. She had to escape, and fast. She made the dangerous journey over the Pyrenees on foot, the same route she'd guided so many pilots along. German bullets whistled past her ears as she ran, but she made it to Spain, and from there to Britain. Many people would have called that enough. Nancy had done her part, risked her life, saved countless others. She could have sat out the rest of the war in safety. Instead, she walked into the offices of the Special Operations Executive and volunteered to go back. The SOE was Britain's secret army, created by Winston Churchill with the directive to set Europe ablaze through sabotage and subversion. They'd been reluctant to recruit women at first, assuming they couldn't handle the physical and psychological demands. But agents like Nancy were proving that women could be just as effective as men, sometimes more so, because the Germans underestimated them. The training Nancy underwent was brutal. She learned to parachute from aircraft in pitch darkness. She mastered explosives, learning exactly where to place charges to bring down a bridge or derail a train. She practiced silent combat techniques, including hand-to-hand methods that could neutralize an enemy sentry without a sound. She trained with various weapons, from pistols and rifles to the Sten submachine gun. She learned radio operation, codes, and most importantly, how to survive behind enemy lines where capture meant certain death. Her instructors were amazed. They called her one of the best and bravest agents they'd trained. In April 1944, just weeks before D-Day, Nancy Wake parachuted back into occupied France. She was coming home to finish what she'd started, but everything had changed. The Gestapo had captured her husband Henri and tortured him to death trying to find out where Nancy was hiding. She wouldn't learn this until after the war, but the loss would haunt her forever. For now, she had a mission: prepare the French resistance for the Allied invasion. Nancy was dropped into the Auvergne region of central France with weapons, explosives, and money. Her job was to coordinate and arm the Maquis, the rural resistance fighters who operated from the forests and mountains. When she arrived, she found them brave but disorganized, more of an enthusiastic rabble with guns than a disciplined fighting force. The French resistance fighters didn't want to take orders from a woman. They wanted the money and weapons she brought, but they didn't think she could lead them. So Nancy did what she always did. She proved them wrong. She outdrank them in their own drinking contests. She showed she could handle weapons as well as any of them. She proved she was tougher, smarter, and more determined than anyone expected. Within a month, Nancy Wake was the commander of 7,000 Maquis fighters in the Auvergne. 7,000. She'd gone from smuggling pilots one at a time to leading an army, and she was about to make the Germans very, very sorry they'd ever heard the name White Mouse. Nancy led from the front. She didn't just give orders from some safe headquarters. She went on the raids herself, carried weapons, fought alongside her troops. The German military would later admit that no sector in all of France caused them more trouble than the Auvergne region under Nancy's command. Her specialty was sabotage, and she was devastatingly effective. Railways were constant targets. The Germans relied on trains to move troops and supplies, and Nancy's teams learned to place explosives that would derail entire convoys. Bridges became prime targets too. Her Spanish Maquis fighters, who had extensive knowledge of explosives, helped blow bridges across major rivers, cutting off German supply routes and forcing them to take long detours that wasted precious time and fuel. But Nancy's most audacious operation was a direct assault on the Gestapo headquarters in Montluçon. The Gestapo there had been causing particular problems for the resistance and terrorising the local population. Nancy planned the raid for exactly 12:25 in the afternoon. She knew that with perfect German punctuality, the Gestapo officers would be gathering for their meal at 12:30. At precisely 12:25, Nancy and her fighters leapt from 4 cars, dashed into the building and cleared every room with grenades and machine gun fire. Upstairs and down they swept through in a whirlwind of violence. Within 30 seconds, they were back in their cars and gone. Many Gestapo officers were casualties that day. It was a message. Even in their own headquarters, they weren't safe. Nancy's sabotage efforts had a direct impact on the success of D-Day. When Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, one of the German army's biggest problems was getting reinforcements to the front. Why? Because the railways were destroyed, because the bridges were down, because supply convoys kept getting ambushed by resistance fighters who seemingly appeared out of nowhere, struck hard, and vanished back into the countryside. The preparations Nancy and other SOE agents made in the months before D-Day were crucial. They armed and trained resistance networks across France. They coordinated sabotage efforts to disrupt German communications and supply lines. They gathered intelligence about German troop movements and fortifications. All of this information flowed back to Allied commanders, helping them plan the invasion. After D-Day, Nancy's mission shifted to slowing the German retreat. The Allies didn't want German forces escaping back to Germany where they could regroup and prolong the war. Nancy's Maquis fighters harassed retreating German columns, ambushed convoys, and made every mile of their withdrawal as costly as possible. One of Nancy's most legendary exploits came when her team's radio codes were lost. Without those codes, they couldn't communicate with London. The entire network was at risk. Nancy volunteered to cycle to another resistance cell to get new codes. The journey was over 300 kilometres through occupied territory, across mountain passes, past German checkpoints. She cycled for 3 days straight, evading patrols and pushing through exhaustion. She got the codes, restored communications, and saved the network. That mission alone would have been enough to make her a legend. Nancy Wake wasn't the only woman doing this impossible work. The SOE recruited 39 female agents for operations in France alone, and every one of them was remarkable. Virginia Hall, known as the Limping Lady because of her prosthetic leg, was considered by the Gestapo to be the most dangerous of all Allied spies. Despite her obvious identifying feature, she operated in France for years, organising resistance networks and evading capture through clever disguises and sheer audacity. André de Jong, who went by the codename Dede, founded the Comet Line that rescued 800 Allied servicemen. She was just 24 years old when she started personally escorting downed pilots over the Pyrenees. She made dozens of these dangerous crossings herself, leading airmen through mountain passes in winter conditions that claimed lives even without the threat of German patrols. Violette Sabo was dropped into France the day after D-Day to help coordinate resistance efforts. She was captured after a fierce firefight where she provided covering fire so her comrades could escape. Despite brutal torture, she never revealed any information. She was executed at Ravensbrück concentration camp in February 1945, just months before the war ended. She was 23 years old. These women, and dozens of others like them, worked in the shadows doing work that was never supposed to be acknowledged. They jumped from planes into enemy territory with suicide pills in case of capture. They lived with false identities, always one mistake away from exposure. They carried weapons, planted explosives, fought in firefights, and coordinated military operations. And for years after the war, most people had no idea they'd even existed. By September 1944, the war in France was effectively over. Nancy's Maquis forces had accounted for thousands of German casualties. The region she commanded had been liberated. But the victory was bittersweet. She'd lost her husband. She'd seen friends and comrades captured and executed. She'd done things in war that would haunt her forever. She later admitted she'd once terminated a German sentry with her bare hands to prevent him from raising an alarm, using the combat techniques the SOE had taught her. When the fighting ended, Nancy Wake was the most decorated woman of World War II. France awarded her the Legion of Honour and the Croix de Guerre. Britain gave her the George Medal. The United States presented her with the Medal of Freedom. Australia, her home country, was slower to recognise her, only making her a Companion of the Order of Australia in 2004, more than 60 years after the war. Nancy struggled after the war. She suffered from what we'd now recognise as PTSD. She remarried, tried politics in Australia but never won an election. The skills that made her an effective spy and resistance fighter didn't translate well to peacetime. She eventually moved back to England, where she spent her final years at a home for retired service members. She passed away in August 2011 at the age of 98, having outlived most of the people who knew what she'd accomplished. The story of Nancy Wake and the other female SOE agents matters because it challenges everything we thought we knew about World War II. These weren't women on the sidelines. They were in the thick of combat, making tactical decisions that affected thousands of lives, taking the same risks as any soldier on the front lines. They proved that courage, intelligence, and determination matter more than gender when the stakes are survival itself. The impact these women had on the war was enormous. The 7,000 Allied airmen rescued by escape lines could fly again, bomb again, fight again. The bridges destroyed by Nancy Wake's sabotage teams delayed German reinforcements by days or weeks. The intelligence gathered by female SOE agents helped Allied commanders make better decisions. Every railway demolished, every convoy ambushed, every German soldier tied down fighting resistance networks in France was one less threat on the beaches of Normandy. Military historians now recognise that the work of SOE agents, both men and women, was essential to the success of D-Day. General Dwight Eisenhower himself acknowledged that the French resistance, armed and trained by agents like Nancy Wake, was worth several divisions of regular troops. That's not hyperbole. That's the assessment of the man who commanded the entire Allied invasion. These women faced dangers that most of us can't imagine. 12 of the 39 female SOE agents sent to France didn't survive the war. They were captured, tortured, and executed in concentration camps. They knew the risks when they volunteered. They understood that if they were caught, their death wouldn't be quick or easy. They did it anyway, because they believed stopping fascism was worth any sacrifice. Nancy Wake lived long enough to see her story told. Books were written about her life. She attended reunions with other SOE agents, swapping war stories over drinks. She never forgot the people she'd fought alongside, the Maquis fighters who'd accepted her as their commander, the resistance members who'd risked everything, the pilots she'd helped save. She dedicated her autobiography to all the people who'd helped the Allied cause during the dark years of occupation. When Nancy Wake passed away in 2011, her ashes were scattered over the French countryside where she'd fought. It was what she'd always wanted, to return to the hills where she'd commanded her fighters, to the land she'd helped liberate. For a woman who'd spent her life in motion, always one step ahead of danger, always pushing forward, it was the perfect final rest. The legacy of Nancy Wake and her fellow female spies lives on in every museum exhibition about the SOE, every book written about the French resistance, every documentary about the secret war. Their story reminds us that heroism comes in many forms, that sometimes the most effective warriors are the ones the enemy underestimates, and that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the cause is just. These women changed warfare. They proved that intelligence agencies needed to recruit the best people regardless of gender. They showed that women could parachute into combat zones, lead troops, conduct sabotage, and match any male agent in courage and effectiveness. The modern intelligence services of Britain, America, and their allies learned from these pioneers. Today, women serve in every aspect of intelligence and special operations because Nancy Wake and others like her proved it was possible. So the next time you think about World War II, remember it wasn't just won by armies and navies and air forces. It was won by a woman on a bicycle cycling 300 kilometers to save her network. By a woman with a prosthetic leg organising resistance cells under the Gestapo's nose. By a 24-year-old woman leading pilots over the Pyrenees in the dead of winter. By a socialite-turned-saboteur who commanded 7,000 fighters and made the Gestapo wish they'd never heard of the White Mouse. Their war was fought in shadows and silence, with false papers and hidden weapons, with courage that most of us will never need to summon. And they won. They won because they were smart enough, tough enough, and determined enough to do whatever it took to stop evil, even when that meant putting themselves in mortal danger every single day for years. Nancy Wake once said that freedom was the only thing worth living and dying for. She proved she meant it, and in proving it, she helped secure freedom for millions of people who never knew her name, who never knew about the woman on the bicycle racing through the night, carrying hope and revolution in her heart. If this story amazed you as much as it amazed me to research and tell, do me a favour and hit that like button. Subscribe to Ignis Tempora for more stories from history that deserve to be remembered. These tales of courage and sacrifice need to be told, and I've got plenty more where this came from. Until next time, remember that heroes come in all forms, and sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one your enemy never saw coming.